All right, we are live.
Welcome, my dear friends. This is Dean Sanjeev Khagram of the Thunderbird School of Global Management at the Arizona State University Enterprise. Welcome to the Globinar we're hosting today on Agile Governance for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We're gonna give everyone a minute or so to join and then get started. So please just stand by, and thank you for joining us. We hope that you are safe and healthy wherever you might be. Thank you. Well, it looks like we already have a great group, 80 participants, super, and I know that we're expecting over 100. So we will get started since we have such a good group again. My name is Dean Sanjeev Khagram at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. Just to give you a sense, we at the Thunderbird School are the #1 school for global management leadership in the world. Our vision is a world of sustainable and equitable prosperity. And we have created a mission for ourselves since I took over the school about two and a half years ago, to train and empower, educate global leaders and managers who will maximize the benefits and of course also minimize the costs of the fourth industrial revolution. A good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. We hope that you are safe and healthy wherever you may be in these incredibly challenging times when it seems like our countries, our world, our planet is on fire. And yet we at the school and Arizona State University, more broadly, are dedicated to 3 fundamental principles. The first one is inclusion. We judge ourselves by who we include and not who we exclude. Second is, of course, innovation. And third is impact. So inclusion, innovation, and impact at global scale is what we are committed to. And since the pandemic, we have really focused on advancing this in every way possible. Obviously, in transforming our own processes and offerings, including having an avatar robot graduation, which allowed our students to safely graduate, to advance a future-ready digital global mindset for everyone from our women entrepreneurs at the bottom of the pyramid to our senior executives at the very, very top of the pyramid. And third, to continue to provide not only thought leadership, but convening of thought leaders as we are doing today with our incredible moderator and panelists. So without further ado, let me just introduce Professor Landry Signe. He has joined, I'm not gonna go through all of these things. At ASU, we also run executive education programs, and we are unique in the sense that we can do that unparalleled in the world in terms of our transdisciplinary offerings. Including from engineering to sustainability, law to health solutions, and anything and everything in between, the most transdisciplinary suite of executive education offerings. Secondly, we have 12 regional centers of excellence around the world, from Nairobi to Tokyo, Dubai, to Seoul, and all over the world, Geneva and many others, DC, Los Angeles. We'll soon be launching in Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Mumbai, and Istanbul when the pandemic allows. And so third, of course, is the digital transformation. At ASU and Thunderbird, we pride ourselves to be the very much on the frontier of this acceleration of the fourth industrial revolution, including and very much so in higher education that has happened as a result of the pandemic. So with that, let me now, without further ado, introduce Professor Landry Signe. Part of this transformation we've undertaken at Thunderbird is to bring incredible faculty, thought leaders, scholars and practitioners such as Professor Landry. I won't go through his impressive and incredible CV. We're just so delighted and honored that he chose to join us after a distinguished career, both in the world of academy and practice, as well as being a young global leader with the World Economic Forum. I want to welcome, Landry will introduce our 3 panelists, but I want to thank Stephen, Kris, and Lisa for joining us. They are incredible. We're so honored to have them with us. And I know it's going to be a phenomenal hour of learning and exchange and reflection. So without further ado, let me pass it over to Landry. Landry?
Thank you very much, Dean Khagram, for this very generous and kind introduction. So I'm honored to be part of your team. So, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on as to where you are in the world. And welcome to this webinar on Agile Governance for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So, as you know, we are living in a complex world with the increased reign of uncertainty. COVID-19, geopolitics, oil price war, trade and trade war, cyber security challenges, the climate crisis, the nuclear security, the financial and monetary system which are under stress, the global migration, the stress to democracy, to civic participation, among others. To this complex and uncertain world, we also have the diffusion of governing power around the world, from central government, from federal government, to cities, to region, to companies, to transnational actors, within global governance and digital communication, among other sectors. So this is combined with the rise of disruptive technologies associated with the fourth industrial revolution, which are going at a much faster speed than the government regulation. So of course, when you speak about technologies associated with the fourth industrial revolution, we are talking about the artificial intelligence, robotics, blockchain, automated vehicles, big data, among others. So you know them. So under such circumstances, it is critical to put values at the heart of the policy-making process, which should also be human-centered. So with the questions of ethics, human rights, inclusion, civic participation, among other, but also multi-stakeholder collaboration with the co-creation, open government, crowdsourcing, public-private philanthropic partnership, among others. So those will be extremely important in the post-COVID-19 era. As a matter of fact, the complex demand made on governments and businesses will require agility, responsiveness, flexibility, and ultimately effectiveness, which are at the heart of agile and multi-stakeholder governance. So agile governance will therefore require spatial and flexible public and private agencies or executive structure, which can answer with accountability, with effectiveness, with the appropriate speed, among other, to immediate challenges, while engaging in a much larger strategic reform, including legislative one, to generate the expected values. So in order to demystify agile governance for the fourth industrial revolution, I would like to welcome a phenomenal speaker, and I can say it because I've heard them in the past. They have spoken in my own courses that I teach on agile governance in the fourth industrial revolution, and students were so much impressed that I decided to share their wisdom with a larger group of people. So our first speaker is Stephen Almond. He has led the UK government's program to transform his regulatory environment to enable innovation, and is also the architect of its 2019 white paper on regulation for the fourth industrial revolution. As a matter of fact, he's passionate about the power of innovation in improving lives, as well as has played a critical role in the government tech initiatives to bring technology into regulation with the UK government. And accessory, of course, among all his extraordinary accomplishments, he's also a fellow at the World Economic Forum Centre for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and graduated from the UK Civil Service Future Leaders SHAM, as well as with a degree from both the University of Oxford and the London School of Economics. Our second speaker is Kris Broekaert. He's a government engagement lead for the World Economic Forum's Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution Network. And he has also been a co-author of the Forum Trailblazing 2018 paper on agile governance, reimagining policy making in the fourth industrial revolution. And he managed the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Agile Governance, a network with the world's foremost thought leader and expert in this area. So of course, he has worked with Accenture, among other critical role, and graduated from Ghent University and the University of Bath. And last but not least, we have Lisa Witter, who is the co-founder and executive chair of Apolitical, a global peer-to-peer learning platform used by public servants in more than 170 countries. So the tech company's mission is to really accelerate the transformation of government. And Apolitical was named as one of the fast companies, most innovative companies in 2018. In addition of being a World Economic Forum Young Global Leaders and co-chairs, one of the co-chairs of the Forum Council on Agile Governance, she has served 6 years on the Brain and Behavior Council. Lisa is really a rock star, a serial entrepreneur, served on numerous corporate boards, former public servants, among others, and as also an American living in Berlin. She worked in a pit crew, and her childhood nickname was Animal. So you can clearly see when she will be speaking her unique perspective, as she's a nature freak and, of course, I should not say it, but a king tap dancer. So without taking longer, let me give the floor to Kris, who will present the case for agile governance. Kris, you have the floor.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction, Landry. I loved your colorful introduction of you all, and I think it's adamant of kind of the people that we are dealing with in agile governance. Always a lot of people who are really eager to be creative, to experiment, to be open, and I hope we can transmit some of that spirit in today's presentation as well. Quickly, not much to add to your great introduction you gave on why this is so important in the fourth industrial revolution. Unlike the first three revolutions, where really reuse technologies to become more efficient as an organization, we feel that the fourth industrial revolution is different. You mentioned the speed of development of these new technologies, but I think what is even more important is that they are so interconnected, and they are therefore blurring lines between industries. They are changing how we exchange with each other as humans, and that creates a whole new set of challenges for policymakers. Challenges where we cannot fully anticipate how the future will look like, because we go outside of the boundaries of what we are used to and what we know. And we also kind of acknowledge that there are huge opportunities that these new technologies can bring. And so policymakers are really eager to know kind of how can we maximize the opportunities that these emerging technologies can bring, and hence be kind of as welcoming as possible to these emerging technologies. But at the same time, of course, keep kind of the inherent reason why policymakers are there, to safeguard society, to also make sure that emerging technologies are introduced in a way that is inclusive and sustainable. And so what are the two kind of key problems that policymakers are looking at? Is one, as you mentioned, the pacing problem. So how can we, at one side, be more kind of speedy about how we create regulation for emerging technologies, but then also make sure that we are sustainable and inclusive. And often kind of these two are kind of seen as contradictory to each other. So what techniques can we develop that helps us to do that hand in hand? I think that's one key issue we want to address with agile governance. The other is that interconnected nature that creates a bigger need for coordination. Coordination with different government departments than we were used to in the past. Also coordination with citizens and humans to make sure that regulation is really human-centered, but then also coordination with businesses that by themselves can also be actors that make sure that they are developing governance and policy for the emerging technologies that they are developing. So as such, we are really looking at agile governance, and we at the World Economic Forum defined it as adaptive, human-centered policy making that is sustainable and inclusive, and that acknowledges that policy making is no longer the remit of governments alone, but is a multi-stakeholder effort. Of course, this is a very broad term, and Stephen and Lisa will tell more about kind of how we translate that in more practical principles, and what the skills are that we need to have to make sure we can practice this. One thing about agile governance is that it has created a lot more interest in current times as a reason of the COVID-19 pandemic, because there are new technologies such as telemedicine that before were kind of nice to have, but currently they are indispensable tools to make sure that we can continue to live our society. And hence there is kind of a renewed interest on how we can accelerate the use of these technologies in our society. Also because we've seen that governments have allowed a lot of these technologies, but to do that they had, for example, to relax data policy regulation, and they did it in a kind of a forced way. So this is, of course, coming with a lot of risks for our society. So how can we become more agile in our policy making so that we are ready to address the next shock that would come to our system? When we are talking about, in the rest of the presentation, about principles of agile governance and skills that we need to have, I think it's always very useful to talk and have kind of a real case study in mind where we can really kind of apply the principles to exactly. And for this seminar, we've chosen the case study of the introduction of e-scooters in the UK. E-scooters are tools that can make transportation, especially in cities, much more safe in an environment like today, where having a lot of people on buses or in subways is considered as a health risk to our society. But in the UK, their e-scooters have only been allowed on the streets since the 1st of July, because there were a lot of kind of fears that e-scooters would be left everywhere in the streets and that they would create a lot of nuisance to the city infrastructure. Now we have introduced them in the UK, and so what we want to discuss with you is how do the principles that Stephen will talk you through how could you apply them to the introduction of e-scooters to make sure that we are allowing this new and interesting technology in a proactive way. So let me pause there. I would encourage you all to share your comments and your thoughts on the chat. Stephen will go through the principles, and from time to time we will pause and reflect on some of the comments that you have made. So please be as interactive as possible. And with that, I'll hand it over to Stephen.
Yes, thank you very much, Kris, for a beautiful introduction. So I would like to encourage all the distinguished member of our audience to participate in the chat, but also to ask your question in the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So please do ask your questions. Our distinguished speaker will be answering them along the way, and interact and answer the questions which are asked in the chat as well, as we want to make this session as interactive as possible. So Stephen, you have the floor now.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And look, it's great to meet you all. I'm going to give you a quick tour of the different practices that governments and particularly regulators are adopting in this new context. The reason that we're focusing today on regulation is actually, regulation is in many respects the really hard thing to change. Its laws are designed not to be changed, to last for a long period of time. And so this period of intense innovation and disruption creates a real challenge for how governments and citizens really think about the role of regulation. So I'm going to run through these themes pretty quickly so that we can have enough time for your questions today. Please do, as Landry says, put these in the chat, and Kris will intervene every so often to pose these questions to me and get the discussion going. So we're seeing a range of new disciplines be introduced now. I'll just talk you through the different concepts that we're starting to see. So the first thing that we're seeing a lot more of is anticipatory governance. Governments aiming to really get a head start on innovation and disruption by using horizon scanning, scenario planning, engaging much more broadly with innovators to understand what the future might hold. So an example of this would be, for example, in the UK, where they have established a Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation to scan the horizon and identify new opportunities and risks from data-driven technologies that might need to be managed. But what we're seeing is governments aren't in a rush to regulate in response to these complex situations which require some really careful thought about how to manage these new technologies. We're seeing governments employ much greater use of non-statutory approaches, so things like regulatory guidance, voluntary industry standards, and other approaches that can be adapted much more easily in response to innovation and disruption. And where they are resorting to legislating or regulating, they're typically doing so in a very outcome-focused way, defining the expectation of the final goal that businesses aim to achieve, and giving them much more freedom to innovate and do things differently as they determine how best to achieve those. So, for example, in Rwanda, in a project with the World Economic Forum, they've devised a framework of performance-based regulation for drone services, and particularly for drone delivery of medical supplies, which is much more focused on the end outcome and the performance of the drones rather than on technical specifications, and it enables that system to adapt to a very fast-moving technological environment, as well as bring forward some of the benefits to citizens much sooner. And so the third area that I would just like to draw out just briefly is this idea of experimental regulation. And so what we're seeing governments do is really use a lot more experimental frameworks to enable the testing and trialing of new technologies. Now, that might be by providing advice to innovators on their own sort of new products and services. That might be about designing, co-designing experiments with innovators to enable the testing and trialing under supervision. Or it might actually be about putting out a call to the market and saying, actually, we really want to see innovation in these areas. How can this emerge? The classic example around this that many people will have heard of is the idea of a regulatory sandbox, which is a framework for testing and trialing of new innovations under a regulator's supervision. And one which originated in financial services, but now is really spreading to every different sector and every different region. And here's an example from Singapore, where they have used it to facilitate innovation in the energy sector, for example. I'm going to pause here just before we go into the next few themes. Kris, is there anything from the chat box, any questions to draw out?
Well, following on your first point on foresight scanning, there were a number of comments here where people mentioned a lot of countries have foresight units, and I think one of the questions that it raises is, should each of the departments have their own foresight unit, or how important is kind of strategic collaboration or coordination between government departments useful in doing horizon scanning? One other topic where that I've heard in previous discussions is that a lot of us kind of realize the need to look at the horizon and do horizon scanning, but it's sometimes hard to know when to do it and to create a time for it with all of the other tasks we have as policymakers. So I think these kind of as two kind of reflections on the first topic in horizon scanning. Any reactions, Stephen, on kind of how you see horizon scanning and foresight can be done in a good way?
So that first point around coordination of horizon scanning is a really interesting one, and actually one where we're seeing governments behave in a different way. Previously, you might have assumed that foresight would be something that would be decentralized, everybody just does it in their own area. But actually, because exactly as you said, Kris, we're seeing innovations emerge which cut across all sorts of different boundaries. What's being increasingly important is that coordinated response across different parts of government. So for example, in the UK, they've now established a new cross-cutting council called the Regulatory Horizons Council to advise government and ensure a joined up response. But that doesn't remove the need for each individual regulator and part of government to understand the risks themselves. Now, that question of how do you prioritize resource for this, I think is a really interesting and challenging one. But I think the case for why you need foresight and anticipation has never been brought more to the forefront than during the current pandemic, where actually it has really shown and highlighted in quite a number of cases that this was a risk that people knew about, and yet some of the basic thinking, exactly as you said, around things like how might we enable telemedicine, for example, had not yet been progressed. And so it's one of those things, it may seem like a nice to have until it's too late. We'll move on just to the next section.
One more thing, I think, making connection between what you say and what Lisa will talk about is a comment from Bill Eggers that there are indeed different ways of doing foresight, and that it does not always need to be a foresight unit that is created, but that a lot is about kind of creating the idea and the comfort to embrace and prepare for uncertainty while taking the steps to anticipate it. And it comes back to a lot to kind of what is a culture we can create to be agile. And I think Lisa will speak to that in terms of kind of what skills and human traits are necessary for agility.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, look, with that sort of covered off there, let's move on to some of the other themes, and particularly the enablers that you need for this more outcome-based anticipatory approach. And actually this really requires you to be able to spot issues and intervene in a much more timely way in this new paradigm. So we're seeing a much greater emphasis on things like risk-based regulation, and the regulators who are really at the forefront of this trend are really taking advantage of the range of technological advances that we're seeing to improve their own ways of regulating. So adopting what some people will call RegTech, regulatory technologies, to enable them to monitor what's happening in the real world, to automate interventions, and to become much smarter in their own operations. What this paradigm also really relies on is responsible industry-led governance. If you're saying that regulators should step back and think, actually, how can we regulate at the outcome level, you are placing quite a high degree of responsibility on industry to develop the ways of responding to that call for the outcome, and develop their own ways of managing some of the risks from technology. And actually that's a good place to place that responsibility, because businesses will know much more about the risks of the things that they are developing than a government will. But there is a real emphasis now, I think, on governments thinking really hard about how to foster that sort of responsible industry self-governance. And we're seeing examples like with Netflix and other video on demand services, people thinking, right, okay, actually, maybe we can take a different approach to something like broadcasting regulation, where previously we might have had quite heavy content controls, and actually maybe we can shift that balance of responsibility between government and industry. So I'll pause there. Kris, I can see that there's all sorts happening in the chat.
But I think more introductions to each other. So I think one question that I raised on the chat is: can businesses be trusted to self-regulate? Any reactions there would be great.
So businesses definitely can be trusted to self-regulate, but there are some real choices here about how to strike that balance between government and industry responsibility, depending on the nature of the sector, and that depends on the maturity of the businesses within the market. It depends on how likely people are to comply, and it depends also on things like the structure of the market as well. And so how you work with a market which is relatively small and contains a small number of established players, for example, is very different to how you might operate with a market which includes a large number of people, many of whom you'll never know and maybe never know exist, and some of whom may not necessarily wish to comply. And there you might take a very different strategy. So let's move on and just cover off the last couple of themes, and just that thought about coordination here, and particularly here, one of the things that is really important is recognizing, as we said earlier, that innovation cuts across regulatory boundaries. And so it's really important to have a coherent policy response. And that includes across different parts of government. It includes across different regions and states, for example. And we're seeing, again, much more emphasis on this. So, for example, in Denmark, they've established a one-stop shop for all new business models, irrespective of what part of the economy they come from. to provide joined up advice and to ensure a coordinated response from different parts of government. And the same thing is really true when you start to look at the international level, and you see the importance here of international regulatory cooperation. And so, you know, that might be trying to self-align with what others are doing, or it might be more collaborative arrangements. And we're seeing a real focus now on cooperation between regulators on matters of innovation. This is a nice example of the Global Financial Innovation Network, which has got really ambitious plans to bring together a group of financial services regulators to support innovation, not just to kind of align their policies, but really to support innovators to cross market boundaries and to scale across multiple administrations. So referring businesses between themselves, sharing intelligence, creating joint testing environments, has a very grand scope there. And just before we go back to the case study, I'd like to just revert to one of the points that somebody raised a little bit earlier, which is how far to take some of these approaches. And what we're not saying today is that these agile regulatory approaches can be applied without thinking. There are very many trade-offs here between being agile and other things that are considered to be good regulatory practice, things like fairness, openness, proportionality, and actually they can be in tension at times with some of these concepts. So, for example, it can be hard to reconcile an outcome-focused regulatory approach with the case where businesses don't have enough capacity to interpret that approach and to define how to meet those outcomes themselves, or where they deliberately try and avoid meeting those outcomes because then you're giving them much more flexibility and room to avoid that. So strong checks and balances are essential in the design of these approaches, and it's really important to bring that focus back to those good regulatory practices and how they can be brought in. I'm going to pause there for some final questions before we move into the case study.
Perhaps just sharing from the chat, there was some follow-up discussion on kind of what can businesses be trusted to self-regulate. There's no clear yes or no answer, and a lot of nuance that needs to be applied depending on what industry. There was an example raised from self-regulation in airports and in COVID, and some of the issues that are coming with that. So what we want to share here are some tools, but as Stephen mentioned at the end, these have to be kind of thought through in the context and are really kind of pointers that can help us be creative about policy making.
Great. Well, look, Kris, in which case I shall hand back to you to just reintroduce that case study and invite people's thoughts on how to draw on these approaches in terms of this example around e-scooters.
And to both Stephen and Kris, I also want you to be mindful that you have about 5 additional minutes for the presentation.
Great. So we'd love to see kind of which of those concepts that has been shared resonates and that you would apply for introducing e-scooters in the UK. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. And following that, Stephen will give us a little bit of an overview of how the UK Department of Transportation went about this topic. Please share your thoughts on the chat.
So whilst people are submitting their thoughts on this, I'll provide some sort of nudges and pointers around this.
Yes, perhaps Stephen also, as they are presenting their thought, there's a question, for example, from Timothy. He said that he's working around the appropriations and budget process the government one of the state government. Let me not name which one. So he's interested in learning how he can be open to and embrace Agile in an environment embedded in traditional models of planning and budgeting, and help his colleague as well in that transition. And that is a local government in the United States.
Well, thank you so much for that question. I'm going to pause on that question because I know that Lisa is going to talk through the questions around skills here, and exactly how to bring these into your sort of day-to-day role. I think the my sort of personal top tip from my own experience here is starting small and experimenting with approaches and getting people's buy-in based on the success of that. And actually, that's what we're really seeing here, is people adopting Agile approaches, changing their rules and their regimes in small and different ways, and then using that as a case to build and drive even more transformational change. And over a period of just a matter of years, we're now seeing some of those small experiments go really big.
Fabulous. And perhaps you can elaborate on the case so that we'll give the floor to Lisa as well. Excellent.
Well, look, just on the case study here, so the examples that we might draw your attention to would be things like experimental regulation. So is it possible, for example, to enable trials to be set up of rental e-scooters, to grant businesses who are renting e-scooters short-term licenses, and to enable the experimentation in those, and to perhaps exploit something like the geographical diversity to enable different trials to take place in different places, for example, with the view to eventually coordinating those different trials and learning from them in the design of that final regime. When it comes to things like outcome-focused regulation, it may be important to focus on what are the key things, the key outcomes that citizens want, and to draw that out in sort of more deliberative dialogue, and to work with these providers, which is a relatively small number of providers, and see what their response is and how they can focus on those outcomes whilst the technology evolves. And then finally, I'll just touch on the international aspect of this, which is, it's really important to always be thinking about actually what's the opportunity for these things to be sort of used across administrations. Now, e-scooters don't go so far, and I think the transport or the trade aspects of this are relatively small, but actually they're being introduced across a lot of different administrations, and there's lots of different trials and practices to learn from. And so one thing that we'd really encourage is that connecting with others and sharing that learning from these different micro-mobility experiments. I'll pause there and see if anything else has come up in the chat that we should draw out before we hand across to Lisa.
So great. Thank you very much, Stephen, for this fabulous presentation. I know you have much more to share with all of us, and our session is just too short to provide all the insights and the wisdom on the topic. But we will have potentially another session in the future as necessary. And without taking longer, let me now give the floor to Lisa, who will connect all the dots as well as share the insight from a leadership perspective as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Stephen and Kris, Landry, and a special shout out to Bill Edgars and Hillary Sudcliffe, who are on the World Economic Forum's Agile Governance Council. Thank you for your contributions and your comments in the box. We do this collectively. Just Agile requires collaboration, so very grateful for that. I wanna talk a minute about the phrase agile governance. At the very top of the call, I asked people to put in what came to mind. So mutable, flexible, resilient, these words that talked about it. It's interesting to frame the term agile governance. One of the comments that came up is, how is this different than having agile governance inside of a corporate world, which I know many Thunderbird graduates or people on this call are. Yes, we need agility in government. We are, in business, but we're particularly talking about here about agile governance in the government form, and the role of government in that. So I just wanted to say it is very important in the business world. We're talking about it in government, but I wanted to start off with this democracy flywheel, because I think you can't talk about agile governance without talking about all the actors who are involved in that. And you know, a lot of what we need to do to have effective agile governance is having citizens be open to new ways of doing things, as much as government being open to new ways, which just creates a lot. You need to have a lot of conversations around that. And in an ideal space, that's where politics and elections are about, where you get to talk about what sort of world do we want to live in, what role do we want businesses, what role do we want Google and Apple to play in our lives, right? These sort of using politics as a way to talk about them. And I want to focus particularly in this next just maybe 5 minutes on what we call at Apolitical the software of a healthy democracy flywheel, which are those civil servants, those 200 million civil servants around the world who are part of governance. Governance isn't just the domain of regulators. If you're doing it right, it's very multi-sectoral and engages a lot of people. So I want to talk about those 200 million, which Stephen used to be one. He's seconded, and there are many on this call, former or current public servants, either political appointees or civil servants. So I'm going to show you my next slide. So super interestingly, these are some big words, right? Skill sets for the 21st century, governance. So really, what is that 21st century? That's the 4IR. And they're pretty obvious words: adaptability, experimental, cooperative, data literate. And I wouldn't just say that data literate needs to be in your IT department, right? This is like some form of data literacy throughout all levels of government, not just for the people who are data experts. Being able to be reflective, being able to be persuasive, having some sense of proactivity, and being curious. Now, these come from research that we've done talking to governments and civil servants themselves about sort of what do you look for in your colleagues? What do you need to have this agile approach? Now, the funny thing about this is these are really easy words to put on a slide, but they're very hard, A, to know if you have them, and B, to actually help people have them more. Skills and mindsets. Skills are easier, but mindsets are harder. And we're doing lots of looking at Apolitical to find out how we can embed mindset shift within skills. And very interestingly, there's not a lot of screening that governments are doing yet for these particular mindsets going into government, which is why you need to think about the education system from the very beginning, and places like Thunderbird being places where people learn these mindsets and sort of embed these mindsets. One thing I hear time and time again about Thunderbird is inclusivity as being a very important trait. So these are, if we wait until government to get these mindsets, it's what we need this in society in general. And we work a lot on helping public servants get this. I know Bill does as well. We'll go to the next one. And I just wanted to myth bust a little bit for the folks who are like, oh, aren't all the bureaucrats inside of government, aren't they all just these 13% wonks? Don't they just, they know knowledge? It's not true, actually. Folks in government really take a wide swath. We did a recent survey from 97 countries saying, what sort of public servant are you? And many of the traits in the innovator, and I know innovation is important to Thunderbird too, 26% of our respondents said that they were, when they answered the questions, they were quote unquote innovators. And 38 most said that they were directors. You can see 23% unsung hero and 13% wonk. And again, I just want to myth bust that not everyone in government's a wonk, and you need those diversity of skills to actually have agility in government, and then to actually implement, right? You need agility in thinking and agility in implementation. You need a mix of these folks to make things work. Now, I want to also share with you that we do a lot of how interested is government in and learning and having this new mindset. Well, we see growing, and in some governments very, very keen. We've seen examples in the chat, people calling out folks, places like Singapore. I know divisions of the UK, folks in Canada. There's a number of governments, Japan, Brazil. There's lots of interest in matching sort of skills and mindset with being more agile. And when we asked public servants in a recent survey what they want to learn how to collaborate. How can they collaborate more and collaborate between governments to do this? And this is one of the points in the chat. Like, do we all have to do our own foresight, or can we share lessons more? And we're definitely seeing more of a desire in global cooperation. Although we feel like things are more nationalist, the civil servants themselves are finding ways to collaborate with one another. So we don't have to recreate the wheel. We don't have to all do our own testing on that scooter. We can see how it worked in places like Berlin, where I live. And I wanted to let people know that there is a hunger for public servants to learn, to get these skills and mindset, these new 21st century mindset. So 50% are at least spending an hour per week upskilling themselves, and 43% are paying out of their own pockets to actually do that. So there's not just a need for these new mindset and skills, there's actually an interest and action within folks in government to get there. Again, you don't just want agile mindsets inside the regulation unit, you want that throughout the government so that it sort of matches up across divisions. I wanted to share this. This is really credit to Bill Edgars and another one of our colleagues, Christian Basin. And this is in our work at the council, how we thought about agile governance. And I wanted to point out two things about this that I think is important related to skills. One is that there needs to be folks inside of government who understand and spend time thinking about or engaging with these new phenomenons that are really putting the pressures on the 4IR. That means they can't sit in a box inside government. They need to be out in the world experiencing the shared economy, experiencing what data-driven tech and AI is, understanding what value chains are. So we're seeing a lot of trends in government where they want their public servants to go out and be in the world for a while and then come back in and bring those experiences in. So more in and out of government. And they're also needing new skills. You can see in box number 2 that this is a new way of doing things. Hillary was putting in the chat the importance of co-designing and co-creation. We already saw stuff on foresight, crowdsourcing, doing consultations, doing hackathons. I don't want to get stuck in the tactics, but you have to have different skills and mindset to actually go out and co-design this world. I think it was Erwin commented, who's doing stuff around this around the world? Well, there are a lot of governments doing new ways of doing agile governance and working to build the skills underneath it, everywhere from Japan to Singapore to Dubai, to the UK, as we've heard from Stephen, to Canada, and there's more. So there's a real movement, not just in agile governance, but we saw one of the comments talk about appropriations. There's also interest in agile procurement. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because Stephen did a really good job talking about agile regulators, right? So agile governance is not just about agile regulators, but regulation is quite important, particularly if you're in the business sector, which many of you on this call are. But one thing I want to just remind everyone is that the role of the regulator is to put the humans at the center, is to really put the citizens at the center of how this regulation, and that's the value, that's the real value that they're holding in the center, which means you can't be good at doing that if you actually don't spend time with citizens. So really putting citizens at the center requires not just thinking differently, but actually spending time with constituencies to really understand it, which is why I love mayors and city level stuff, because you get closer versus the federal, which tend to be a little bit further away from where the citizens are, which maybe doesn't make you as great as a regulator because you don't really see the effects of it. Now, just to riff off in the last minute here, COVID-19 is a huge example of the need and a test for government's agility. Wow, is it ever? And we're seeing, and I can share in the chat, some excellent examples about how governments either had practiced like they have in Dubai for this moment, and then said, okay, we practiced this. Like, for example, one of our colleagues on the WEF Council has been running 100-day sprints to solve problems inside of government. She had practiced, and now they've gone full force in doing agile response to COVID. So there's great examples how governments have either practiced or been forced to be more agile in their responses to what's going on in COVID. So no longer sit back and wait for agility. We're living in it in a very big crisis way. And I want to share last two slides, Landry, about what governments have been thinking about in this time of COVID. So we spent a lot of time, we've got public servants from 170 countries, and we ask them sort of, what have you learned? What are the new skills that you've learned? Now, it may seem funny to you that working remotely is the number one, but imagine it's very hard to be effective in government if you don't have the agility to even work at home when offices are closed. So this is really, really important. Communications, which is a key skill to being good at agility. You saw that persuasion as being a skill. If you're not good at communications, it's very hard to be persuasive to anyone, any of the stakeholders. Being a good communicator is the number one skill request we get at Apolitical. And then you'll see here next, engaging with citizens virtually. You can't be good at Agile if citizens are at the center and you don't know how to do this. Now governments are having to do this virtually. And then again, you can see here crisis management and collaboration across government. All key things that you need to be Agile. You're seeing these are new skills that have come about. And last, I'll leave you with this slide. What's the priority for governments in preparing for COVID-19 recovery? It should warm your heart that the number one is supporting populations hit hardest by the crisis, right? That's why public servants go into government, is they want to really help people who are hardest hit, particularly now. But you'll see, secondly, something that gives me a lot of hope on our movements around agility, and that's preserving the changes to how government works. Governments have had to become more agile, and they are getting better at it. And our job is to say, okay, yes, we're going to make some mistakes with some agile procurement. Yes, we're going to make some mistakes with some agile ways of working, but it's unlocked a whole new mindset and thinking. And now we have to go back and talk to the citizens about what we've learned to create that healthy democracy flywheel, which businesses are part of that. So I'll stop there and open it up for conversations, put some stuff in the chat box for folks. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Lisa, for a beautiful presentation. A lot of insights. Those are great. So a couple of things. So the first thing that I want to do is perhaps to go quickly through some of the questions in the Q&A, and then I will then give you the floor for the final remark. So Bill Eggers asks, in the US alone, hundreds, if not thousands, of regulations were waived in the wake of COVID-19, ranging from telehealth to different licensing regulations. How should government go about analyzing which of these should permanently go away, be modified, or reinstated post-COVID? Betsy Nelson has also asked, how does society consumer protection fit into this? Individuals' power is clearly not strong enough to fight. So NGOs, civil society, who plays this role? And that was also related to her question on, as world politics move towards more national orientation, how confident are the panelists that there will be successful cross-jurisdictional cooperation and standards that will have provided a, let's say, consistency and needed control. And then the two final questions, and so that everyone will go to one question, all the speakers. Miguel Amaral, for example, asks, given the pace of digital transformation, it is likely that regulatory approaches will require regular adaptation. Do you have any insights on how to achieve this? And finally, Luciano Hypaya, my apologies if I didn't pronounce the name right. In regards to policy and technology, Apple and Google phone products have included tracking for potential COVID-19 tracking apps. Do you think there will be a little pushback from this as due to potential data security issues? I know that we cannot answer perfectly all those questions, but I just want to give the floor to each of the panelists for your final comments and addressing perhaps one of those questions as they conclude. So let me start with Lisa.
Oh, there's so many questions. I feel like, Landry, I want Bill Edgars to come off of mute and answer his own question for himself. Can we give him the floor for a minute? Because he is a massive expert on Agile. Is that okay with you, Landry? And in a collaborative Agile way, can he do that?
That will be fine if tech can provide the mic to Bill Edgars, please, to Bill Edgars. And as he will be allowed to speak, perhaps Stefan can go and start answering the other questions and give his final remark.
Thank you very much. What I find really heartening, and I think what is a really common response to a lot of the questions here, is about the role of the citizen and the importance of citizen design. And that is something that we haven't focused on a lot in our presentation today, because we treat that as core. That's not a new thing. That's something that is a basic requirement, is thinking about the citizen and user design through all of these processes. And so having open dialogue sort of designed into things like experiments. When you're looking at reviewing rules that have been changed very rapidly, for example, through the COVID crisis, making sure that you have citizen buy-in for what the long-term state of those rules may be, for example. So I see that as really, really cool. The other point I just like to sort of bring out in my final response is just, particularly in response to Miguel's comments here, this focus really needs to be on continual experimentation and building that in as a cultural norm, so that actually it's not seen as something which is something that you might occasionally do or you might do in special circumstances, but actually it's the default way in which you learn and develop better rules. And actually you are going to get so much more rich data about what the right result is, that it could be built in much more into the design phase of rulemaking than it is right now.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I will give the floor now to Kris, who will conclude with Lisa.
Great, and I would like to pick up on the question on kind of, are we confident that there will be international collaboration to solve some of these issues? We do feel that there is a lot of interest to learn from what's happening in other countries and to look at international collaboration. But that the structures that we have in place, or the organizations that are there to support international collaboration, such as United Nations or standards organizations, need also to adopt these principles to continue to be effective. We feel that if we are using organizations that are really building on kind of a consensus basis, then that the pace of technology will outpace that system. So that also at that level we need to see at what's happening, and also be comfortable to try and experiment and learn, build on successful case studies to create global technology, rather than to start from building global technology governance and then build down the case studies from there. So this is one thing that we see as in terms of global collaboration. We at the World Economic Forum also really try to build a network of centers where we are experimenting with businesses and governments, and that where we can use like real use cases to then influence international processes for technology governance.
Thank you so much, Kris. So Bill Edgars is not able to join, unfortunately, given the hectic schedule. But of course, we have our own Lisa, who will be giving us the final words.
Well, good. I'm sorry Bill couldn't join because he's such an expert, as I'm sure there are many others on the call. So humble, really. Thank you for having Stephen, Kris, and I. We get to work together on this, and it's a real honor. I wanna leave on a more personal note. We've had a lot of talk about regulation and mindsets and tech. The Edelman Trust Barometer comes out every year, and it's consistently been on this drum about how untrusted government is. Well, one, that's at the federal level. It doesn't look at local level, but let's just take that for what it is. They did an update in May, and government moved ahead of business and trust. Now, we'll see if that holds depending on how the COVID response in government is. But whether it holds or not, the role of government in our lives in the next year or so is going to grow. There's no doubt of it. It needs to. And the role and need for international collaboration is going to grow. And my appeal to everyone is that we need to really invest, not just our money, that's happening, whether we want to or not, but our kind of desire and our time and our smarts to making government and politics work better. And if we don't make government and politics work better, all of this regulation stuff isn't going to work. And that's just simply like better understanding, you know, the government around us and how it works, better understanding who's running for office and getting involved in elections, because it all does really matter. I know this is pedantic to say, but I keep hearing people say, oh, all politicians are horrible and governments are just bureaucratic nightmares. A, that's not true, and B, they will become that way if we think that. So as business leaders, as many as you are, you know better than I do the stake we have in making politics and government work for everyone. And if it works for everyone, it works for you. And I'm really excited about the time we are at the precipice, that we have young people coming into government and politics who are by nature global and optimistic. And I think we should ride this wave to really make that trust and that citizen-centered piece work more. So that's how I'd like to end.
Thank you very much, Lisa. So I also want to just point out a quick comment of my colleague, Anne Florini, who said in the chat that yes, trust is a prerequisite, and which is aligned with what you have just said, Lisa. And there are teachable skills for building that trust and leading collaboration, and those need to be much more widely taught. And I think that is one of your one of the things that you are building and with your broad network. So a couple of things. First, I would like to express my gratitude to our distinguished speaker today, Stephen, Kris, Lisa. We are honored to have hosted you. The Dean unfortunately cannot join right now, but he's also very grateful and to you having joined forces to demystify agile governance for the fourth industrial revolution. So thank you very much. So we also want to, I also want to highlight that in our Executive Master of Global Affairs and Management here in Washington, DC, for example, so we have a course dedicated on agile governance in the fourth industrial revolution, and Stephen and Kris intervene outstandingly, and Lisa will be on the next round of distinguished panelists. So that is another point that I would like to highlight. I'm also very grateful. We are very grateful for the audience, so who stayed with us for a much longer time that they committed. So that shows the critical importance of this topic. And I would also like to express my gratitude to our colleague, Mike Grasso and Olivia Mulava, who have made this event possible from the tech side, from the mobilization side, and are strategic partners for all our Thunderbirds event. So thank you very much to everyone, and looking forward to the next session. Bye.